to life. Just a few weeks ago, we did an event where we had some special guest speakers joining us to reflect on these different pillars, as well as our internal team. Check it out if you want to learn more. But in my remaining time, I do want to just share a little bit more of a quite specific case study, because I think that that's really helpful when it comes to how we think about ways in which we really bring nature together within our businesses. Now, this is the story of the Akuba tree. Now, the Akuba is a tree that grows in the Amazon. And actually, for many, many, many years, it was harvested in order to use the strength of that wood to build a whole lot of products, things like wood used in housing, but also things like pencils and broomsticks, handles. And I think the story here is quite powerful, because it is these trees that were so strong and so there was such a use for them that was seen to be with these materials, that actually the trees were cut down to the point where it was on an endangered list. Now at Natura, we have scientists who are working on formulas and ingredients. We also have social scientists and cultural anthropologists. And actually, through the connections that we have with local communities, traditional communities and local peoples, what we were able to understand was actually these Akuba trees have seeds. And actually, the seeds of the Akuba trees have incredible nourishing properties when you bring it down to their oils. And so because of that understanding, the Natura team worked in partnership with these different communities and were able to help set up cooperatives with the view of how to help those communities not cut down the trees, but instead find ways to regeneratively harvest those seeds, and that those seeds, and therefore the oil from them, could be used to create really, really high quality, beautiful products, which have become the Akuba line. Now, I know we're on technology, so this isn't really going to work, but I brought an example of a product of the Akuba, which is now this beautiful nourishing cream, and you wish you could smell it because it's delicious. But that's a great example of where you can have the triple win. Make sure that we are protecting the forest, protecting nature, helping the communities actually have a different way of generating income in their communities, but also for us as a business, building a beautiful product. Now, John, I can see you jumping on the screen, which I think means that we are transitioning to the Q&A section. I do just want to end with one last point. Actually, it's one point that has two components to it, which is about enabling. And I do want to sort of make sure that as we think about ways in which businesses can create the conditions where climate and nature comes together, there's sort of two things that have been an important part of our story at Natura & Co. The first is governance. So we are a B Corp. Natura was the first publicly traded company to become a B Corp in 2014, which means at a governance level, what we have done is that we really make sure that in our bylaws, our legal constitution, there is a very explicit link to how we as a company have to consider both shareholders as well as stakeholders. So that governance is embedded into our bylaws. The second piece really is around culture. And one of the things that I think is important when we think about how we enable this work throughout the business is to recognize we need to find ways to make sure everybody feels like this is part of their job. And that's why we have a series of programs inside Natura & Co., which are really focused on helping people, whether they're in the sustainability team or in our tech team, our HR team, our finance teams, to understand the critical nature of what's happening around nature and climate and what we can all do about it, no matter where in the business we work. But I think that's probably brought me beyond my 10 minutes, John. So thank you all for the amazing attention and the great links. And I'm really looking forward to tucking into some of these questions.
Thanks so much, Shar. Actually, I'm glad you went through the final remarks, because they also resonate with some of the questions we've had of how do you actually make your climate and your nature teams work together. And beyond that, I think what you're telling us is actually embedding that culture amongst the entire company, right? And beyond the employee themselves and the shareholders, then all the other stakeholders that you work with within the supply chain, be it suppliers, service providers, etc., all the way to also downstream, like your consumers, etc. And there's definitely a lot of good practice to learn from Natura & Co here. Without further ado, we have 13 questions and we have about 13 minutes. So unfortunately, we're not going to manage to get through each of them. Otherwise, it would have to be very bullet answers. But let's focus with our panelists We can all come back on camera if you like, on the most upvoted ones. So we have a first question from Erin, who got quite a lot of upvotes, which concerns indigenous knowledge, and probably very relevant for at least our two business speakers. And Ed also would love to have your insights, if any. So the question from Erin is the following: how are you incorporating indigenous knowledge and perspectives in your work? Specifically, what stakeholder engagement work have you done, or are you doing, or do you recommend doing to ensure inclusion and respect throughout the strategy? So, floor is yours.
I can start. Thank you for such an important question. So specifically to our investments in nature, so nature-based solution, nature climate solution, that's a topic that is extremely important. So there are a few things we do, and I would actually broaden it. It is indigenous knowledge, but is indigenous people, local communities, and it's really about acknowledging that any project you decide to invest in, it's extremely context-based and local, depends on the local context. And in order for you to understand that local context, but also what the local needs and what's relevant or not, you need to engage with the local communities, indigenous people. So that's fundamental. We're doing it in multiple ways. So we usually, based on the project we currently have, we do it through local partners because they know best. And we follow specific processes to ensure that, when you do your stakeholder mapping, you identify all the local groups that need to be part of all the consultation, but also, how do you ensure free, informed, and prior consent? How do you ensure that there are governance and grievance mechanisms so that decision making is clear and how the communities are part of that or that co-design, or, on how to use profits from the project on what to invest for the community. It's completely driven, should be, by the communities. And also, grievance mechanisms. So how do you raise issues, if any? And there is a toolkit we have developed with some more specific tips on potentially how to do that. So happy to share that in the chat.
Maybe I can just jump in if that's okay, John, because actually I think they covered in a ton of the really important points when it comes to learning alongside and being in partnership with some of these communities. And I think all I would just add is that I think it's also important to recognize there is a need for real that cultural sensitivity that comes from understanding those communities directly. So you've mentioned about the local context. I would say, again, we have these incredible people on our team at Natura who this is their role, is to really be building those relationships and recognizing that those relationships have a longevity to them as well. So I think that would be the other thing, is to recognize the importance of, again, building trust, building that connection, and doing it with a longer time horizon in mind. It's something that really requires nurturing deep connections and a level of expertise in how to do those, how to engage in a way that is relevant on both sides of the equation.
Thank you both. Indeed, very important question, and thanks for sharing the best practice from what your companies are doing on that end. In the next question we focused on another group of stakeholders, which are SMEs. So that question from Shelley Lawson was on tools and ideally case studies that are specifically relevant to SMEs with regard to embedding nature in their plans. So now we don't necessarily have SMEs on the in the panel today, but I wanted to acknowledge that question and acknowledge the resource that was shared by the Global Compact Network UK. If you go, for the rest of the audience, if you go in the Q&A and you go to answered questions, you will find some very helpful resources that were shared by Pauline from the UNGC UK. I'll also take the opportunity to flag very quickly a campaign that Business for Nature and its partners, including the UNGC, including WWF, including companies like Natura and GSK. I'll stop here because otherwise the list is very long. But we're basically working on a next campaign that will focus on business strategies on nature. And as part of this campaign, we've developed a handbook that is really designed to help companies from different sectors, different geographies, different revenue sizes to help them design and develop their nature strategy. So I'll just put that link in the chat. The website is still under construction, so we don't have everything here yet. But if you're interested, feel free to also just ping me on LinkedIn and I'll share the key resources with you. With that, let's move to our third question. We have questions from Robert Purchase. And so Robert is asking us, when building sustainability into business strategy, it is my experience that the core elements of emissions reduction, well-being, and circularity have understanding and know-how within traditional disciplines of engineering, human resources, and procurement. Sorry, the question disappeared. I'm back. Biodiversity, net gain, and nature-based solutions tend to require more specialism. If a lack of resource impacts in-house hires or third-party consultancy, how would you approach integration into existing plans and getting senior management sponsorship? So if I understand your question correctly, Robert, there are two elements to it. First is, and maybe that relates somehow to the SME question, but how do you maximize your impact with limited resources and time? And second, within the company. And second, how do you build and how do you gain senior management sponsorship, which we know is so important to have the C-suite on board or the board of executives, etc. So maybe, Ed, is there any reflections from the TPT on that? And then after Ed, would love to hear from you, Shar and Adele.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think there's a couple of things I'd say. I think the first thing is that we do want to be thinking about climate and nature at the same time. So it's really important to start addressing these questions now and start thinking about those gaps in your organization. A big part of transition planning is around governance. And so that's really important to start considering. I think as a slightly more practical suggestion, but I'd be interested as into Adele and Charles' view, I think I would really start with assessing and understanding. Use tools like TNFD to understand where your business's specific exposure to nature issues is. And from there, you can start to understand as well what capability you might need and what gaps you have. And while, there are going to be short-term costs potentially with building some of that resource, without that picture, you're also holding a longer term and difficult to understand risk. But I'd welcome views on that as well.
Sorry, do you want to?
I can jump in.
Or Adele, if you want.
Very quickly, yeah. So absolutely agree. And I would build and say there are a lot of resources now out there to guide you. And I think that guiding, it's fundamental to understand what are the no regret actions, right? Those things that you would do anyway. And I would then suggest from a corporate perspective, turn those into objectives for specific people, because that will focus your action. And even better, if within your governance, those people are the same that also own the climate objectives, so that those conversations around trades-off and co-benefit will be done by the same people, because they need to achieve both those targets. That's really, I think, an enabler.
Again, I don't have a whole bunch to add, but I would just say, actually, Adele, something that you talked about in your presentation that I think is important to resurface here is also recognizing that this is a learning journey for all of us, right? New material is coming, new data. So I think building in that sense of being on a quest to be constantly sort of reflecting on what you're doing and looking at what's happening around the world so that you can be evolving that strategy is really key. And so I actually also want to try and hit off one of the themes that seems to also be coming up, which is like, we're coming from big corporations, but what happens if you're a smaller business? And I do think that there's an important connection. Yes, absolutely, taking these steps to do the assessment and building that flexibility in, but also like keep your radar open. What's happening in academia? I'm personally really interested in what's happening, for example, with the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative at Oxford, where they have a series of case studies available. So finding sources of inspiration in different places, knowing that this is something that there is an increasing, I think, activity around in different academic institutions. But also finding collectives. And again, Adele, coming back to your sort of call to action, which is we got to do this together. Like, this is going to be something that not one business is going to be able to lead on. And if you are a big business, there's things that we can do, but also as small businesses, joining into collectives can really be an important way for us to, again, keep on learning and sharing and building forward these strategies. And I would sort of say, I think there's a range of networks that do have a focus on SMEs. And I think finding ways to tune into some of those collectives are an important way to build the networks, build the connections, and have those communities to share and exchange with.
Thank you. Thank you, all three of you, for those answers. We have 1 minute and a half, and I do want to get to that fourth and final question that we'll take for today. We'll have covered all the questions that had 10 votes or more, so I'll feel good about this as a moderator. And I'll look to you specifically, Ed, for that last question. This is a question from Freya, and she's asking on any tips that you may have to share on developing specific metrics and quantifiable targets for nature. So you've referenced TNFD. We've also touched upon SBTN. As a one-liner in 1 minute, maybe what are the main tips or directions that you can signpost our audience on that question?
At the risk of repeating myself, I really would start with TNFD. I think a huge amount of work has gone into answering that exact question in the context of TNFD, and thinking about what some of the key metrics you need to be thinking about are. It also really takes forward a location-based approach. And I think also because it's just going to be such a central part of the ecosystem on this, I think it's the kind of thing that you're going to be able to really do that collaboration and engaging with other bits of guidance that Char mentioned. And there's a sort of smooth pathway between TNFD and with setting targets under SBTN. And so hopefully that's a kind of a road for businesses to follow.
Absolutely. And as you said, it all starts with evaluation, right? So first you assess. Once you've assessed, you can commit on targets that are specific to your impacts, dependencies, the risks, the opportunities you face. And then once you have these, that will be kind of a runway for you to then transform the business model, implement the strategy, etc. So with this, we're right on time for the closing. Thank you to our speakers and panelists for their presentation and for their responses. Thank you all in the audience for your participation, for being with us, for raising your questions, commenting, reacting in the chat. That was a wonderful, lively session. I want to send a special shout out to Pauline from the UNGC UK network, who's done a terrific job prepping us up and setting us for a successful session today, and all the other organizations that have joined. So with this, thank you all for being with us. I'll hand over to Steve for closing remarks.
Thank you very much, John. And also Ed and Adelaide and Char. I don't want to just echo all of your thanks, John, but really what a fantastic session. So really appreciate you all sharing your valuable insights so generously. I feel I need to, well, a special thank you to Char for calling me out on my comments about the SDGs. I think I did not make it clear enough just how interconnected everything is and how absolutely vital action on nature and climate are to achieving all of the goals, and that goal 17 is, of course, the way we're going to do it. And so I'm going to be more careful in how I introduce our connections to the goals going forward, to just really emphasize that interconnectivity and how we need to make progress on them all together. All right. Thanks, everyone. Again, we're about to hit noon, and that means lunchtime. So our next session is going to be on delivering transparency, anti-corruption, and due diligence. It's scheduled to start at 1 p.m., so we've got an hour break. Please do tune back in at 1 p.m. on the same link that you've been using. We've got another fantastic panel of speakers, and we're really keen to have you back. So thank you and bon appetit. We'll see you again soon.